You don't remember, she said softly, her voice nearly lost beneath the low hum of the marble-floored lobby. But it was the kind of quiet that made people turn anyway, the kind that carried weight, the kind that didn't beg to be heard but demanded it. Ethan Cole paused mid-step, his polished shoes reflecting the cold white lights above, his hand still wrapped around his phone as if the entire world had been calling him just seconds ago. But now there was only her, standing there in a worn gray coat that had seen too many winters, a small child asleep against her shoulder, tiny fingers curled into the fabric as if holding on to the last safe place she knew. Ethan's eyes moved over Clara Hayes without recognition. Not yet, just another face in a city of millions, another interruption in a schedule measured in minutes and millions of dollars, but something in the way she stood. Steady despite the exhaustion written into every line of her body, something in the way she didn't look away, made him hesitate. Should I? He asked, his voice calm, almost indifferent, but not dismissive, not entirely, because somewhere beneath the surface, a faint unease stirred, like a memory trying to rise through fog. Clara exhaled slowly, as if she had expected that answer, as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times only to find it still hurt in ways she couldn't prepare for, her hand adjusting the small blanket around her daughter, Lily, who shifted slightly but didn't wake. Her soft breathing the only warm thing in the sterile air. The lobby stretched wide around them, glass walls reflecting a city that never stopped moving, people in tailored suits passing by with quick glances, curiosity flickering and fading just as fast, because in this world, stories like hers didn't belong, not here, not in a building where everything was designed to look perfect. You don't remember? Clara repeated, not accusing, not pleading, just stating it like a fact she had already made peace with, even if her eyes betrayed the truth, a flicker of something fragile, something that had once believed in promises whispered under very different lights. Ethan studied her more closely now, his gaze narrowing slightly, searching for something familiar in the lines of her face, in the quiet strength she carried. But all he found was distance, years of it, like pages torn from a book he no longer owned. Yet the feeling didn't leave, it lingered, subtle but persistent, the way a song stays in your head even when you can't remember the lyrics. I meet a lot of people, he said finally, the words measured, controlled, the kind of response that had built empires and ended conversations. But even as he spoke them, he knew they weren't entirely true, because he didn't forget faces like hers, not ones that carried that kind of quiet gravity. Clara nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, as if she had just confirmed something she already knew, her fingers brushing a loose strand of Lily's hair back into place, the gesture instinctive, protective. The kind that came from years of doing everything alone. For a moment neither of them moved, the air between them thick with something unspoken, something unfinished, and then Clara took a step closer, not enough to invade his space, just enough to make it impossible to ignore her presence. You don't remember, she said again, softer this time, but with a steadiness that made the words feel heavier, like they carried more than just memory, like they carried consequence. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in resistance, because part of him didn't want to remember, didn't want to dig into whatever this was, because the life he had built didn't have room for unfinished stories. But then his eyes dropped, almost involuntarily, to the child resting against her, and something shifted, subtle but undeniable, a flicker of recognition not in memory, but in feeling, a strange, unexplainable pull that made his chest feel tighter than it should. Clara followed his gaze, her expression unreadable, and for the first time there was something like a question in her eyes, not hope, not yet, but something close to it, something that hadn't completely faded. Ethan looked back up at her, and for a brief second, the world outside that lobby seemed to fall away, the noise, the movement, the endless demands of a life built on control, and in that silence, he felt it again, that distant echo of something he couldn't quite place, something that didn't belong to the man he had become, but maybe to the one he used to be. Clara held his gaze, unwavering now, as if she had reached the point where there was nothing left to lose, and then, just as quietly as she had spoken before, she said, You don't remember. And this time, Ethan didn't answer right away, because somewhere deep inside, something was beginning to stir, something that refused to stay buried, something that whispered that forgetting had never really been the truth. The silence stretched just a second too long, the kind that made even the passing footsteps seem louder, sharper, as if the world itself was waiting for something to break. Ethan shifted slightly, his posture still composed but no longer untouched, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around his phone before he slipped it into his pocket, a rare surrender of attention in a life ruled by control. "If this is about a meeting or a request, you can speak to my assistant," he said the words. Automatic, practiced, but softer than before, as if some part of him was choosing not to shut the door completely. Clara let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, not quite defeat, just something in between, something tired, and she shook her head slowly, her gaze never leaving his face, as if she were searching for a version of him that might still exist somewhere beneath the polished exterior. "I am not here for a meeting," she replied, her voice steady despite the weight behind it, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the building's climate system, cool air brushing against skin that had known far harsher conditions. Lily stirred again, a small, sleepy movement, her cheek pressing deeper into Clara's shoulder, and Ethan noticed it this time, really noticed it, the way her tiny hand rested against Clara's collar, the way her breathing came slow and even, the fragile trust of a child who believed she was safe. Something tightened in his chest again, sharper now, less ignorable, and he frowned slightly, not at Clara, but at the unfamiliar feeling itself. "Then why are you here?" he asked, and this time, there was no edge of dismissal, only a quiet demand for clarity, for truth. Clara hesitated, just for a heartbeat, as if deciding how much to say, how much to risk, because she had not come this far to turn back, not after everything it had taken just to stand in front of him again. "Because you were the only one who could answer something I have been carrying for 5 years," she said, each word placed carefully, like stepping stones across something deep and uncertain. Ethan's expression did not change immediately, but his eyes did, a subtle shift, a narrowing that spoke of attention fully claimed now, no longer divided by schedules or expectations, and somewhere beneath that focus, the faint echo grew louder, pressing against the walls he had built around his past. 5 years, the number lingered in his mind longer than it should have, attaching itself to nothing concrete yet refusing to disappear. Clara saw it. That flicker, that almost recognition, and it gave her just enough strength to continue, her hand adjusting Lily again, grounding herself in the present even as the past hovered dangerously close. "You told me something that night," she added quietly, her voice lowering as if the memory itself required a softer tone. "And I believed you." And there it was, not the full truth, not yet, but enough to shift the air between them, enough to turn curiosity into something heavier. Ethan's jaw tightened again, but this time not in resistance, more like concentration, like someone trying to recall a dream that faded the moment they reached for it. Images flickered at the edge of his mind, indistinct, a dimly lit room, the sound of rain against glass, a voice that felt familiar but remained just out of reach, and he inhaled slowly, steadying himself as the fragments threatened to form something whole. "I do not make promises I cannot keep," he said finally, the words carrying the weight of the man he had become, the reputation he had built. But even as they left his mouth, there was uncertainty beneath them, subtle but undeniable. Clara's eyes softened for the first time, not with forgiveness. Not yet, but with something more complex, something that held both understanding and quiet pain, and she nodded once, as if acknowledging that version of him, even if it was not the one she had known. "That is what I thought too," she replied, and the way she said it made it clear that something had broken between then and now, something neither of them had fully faced. Ethan looked at her again, really looked this time, at the exhaustion she did not hide, at the strength she did not boast. At the child who trusted her completely, and the unease inside him grew into something sharper, something closer to truth, and for the first time in years, he felt the unsettling pull of a past that refused to stay buried. The air felt different now, heavier, as if the building itself had shifted around them, and Ethan took a slow step closer, not enough to close the distance, but enough to acknowledge that this was no longer a passing interruption, this was something that had roots, something that had followed him here whether he remembered it or not. His eyes lingered on Clara's face, searching more deliberately now, tracing the lines of someone who had endured more than she said, and then, almost against his will, his gaze dropped again to the child resting against her shoulder, drawn by something he could not explain, something that felt less like curiosity and more like recognition without memory. 5 years, he repeated quietly, as if testing the weight of it, and the number seemed to settle somewhere deep, unsettling the carefully ordered structure of his thoughts. Clara nodded, her grip on Lily tightening just slightly, protective, instinctive, as if she were bracing for something she had already lived through once before. It was raining that night, she said, her voice soft but steady, and the moment the words left her lips, Ethan's breath caught almost imperceptibly, because the image came faster this time, sharper, rain streaking against glass, the faint smell of wet pavement, a city that had looked different through water and exhaustion. He did not interrupt, not now, because something told him that if he spoke too soon, whatever was trying to surface would slip away again. Clara watched him carefully, noticing the shift, the way his expression lost some of its distance, replaced by something more vulnerable, more human, and it gave her just enough courage to continue. "You were not supposed to be there," she said, and a faint, almost ironic smile touched her lips, not out of humor, but out of the memory itself. "Neither was I." And for a moment, her eyes drifted past him, as if she could see that night playing out somewhere just beyond the glass walls. Ethan's mind followed, pulled into fragments that refused to stay scattered now, a late hour, a quiet place, a conversation that had not been planned, and then a feeling, something rare and unguarded, something he had not allowed himself in years. He frowned slightly, not in rejection, but in effort, trying to piece together something that had clearly mattered more than he had realized. "You said something," Clara continued, her voice lowering, as if speaking it too loudly might break whatever fragile connection was forming. "You said that some endings are not really endings, that they are just pauses until people are brave enough to come back." And this time, Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, because the words hit something solid, something real, not just a fragment, but a memory beginning to take shape. His chest tightened, not painfully, but with a kind of pressure that came from recognition, from knowing that those were his words, even if he could not yet see the full picture they belonged to. When he opened his eyes again, there was no indifference left, only a quiet intensity, a need to understand, to fill in the spaces that had been empty for far too long. "Why did you come back?" he asked, and the question was not defensive, not dismissive, it was genuine, almost urgent, because if there had been a pause, then there had also been a reason for the silence that followed. Clara met his gaze without hesitation now, the uncertainty from before replaced by something steadier, something that had been built over years of carrying the truth alone, and she shifted Lily slightly, the child's small hand brushing against her collar as she settled deeper into sleep. "I did not," Clara said softly, and for a moment the words seemed simple, almost too simple, until their meaning settled in. "I never left." And the weight of that statement hung between them, quiet but undeniable, because it suggested something far more complicated than absence, something that had been present all along, unseen, unacknowledged. Ethan's brow furrowed, confusion mixing with that growing sense of recognition, because if she had never left, then it meant that whatever had happened 5 years ago had not ended the way he thought it had, and for the first time, the possibility that he had misunderstood something fundamental began to take shape, unsettling and impossible to ignore. Clara took a slow breath, steadying herself, because this was the point she had imagined 1,000 times, the moment where truth began to move from shadow into light. And her eyes flickered once more to Lily before returning to him, grounding herself in what mattered most. "You remember the ending," she said quietly, her voice carrying both challenge and quiet hope now. "But you do not remember what came after." And this time, there was no turning away from it, no easy explanation, only the growing realization that whatever he thought he knew was incomplete, and that the truth standing in front of him was no longer willing to stay hidden. The words settled between them with a quiet weight that neither of them could ignore, and Ethan felt something shift more deeply this time, not just fragments brushing the surface but something underneath beginning to crack open, something he had not realized was locked away. His gaze moved again to the child in Clara's arms, slower now, more deliberate, as if he were seeing her for the first time instead of just noticing her presence. And there was something in the curve of her small hand, in the soft line of her brow, that made his breath pause for a fraction longer than it should. "What came after?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier distance, because whatever answer she carried, he already knew it was going to change something fundamental. Clara did not respond immediately, not because she did not have the answer, but because saying it out loud meant there was no going back to silence, no returning to the version of the past that had kept them safely apart, and she shifted her weight slightly, grounding herself, feeling the warmth of Lily against her shoulder, the steady reminder of why she was here at all. "You left," she said quietly, her tone even, not accusing, not bitter, just honest in a way that made it harder to deflect. "Before the morning came." And this time the memory did not come in fragments for Ethan, it came in a rush, incomplete but undeniable, a hotel room washed in early gray light, the faint echo of rain still tapping against the window, and a choice, a decision made quickly, decisively, the kind he had built his entire life on. His jaw tightened as he exhaled slowly, because that part he remembered now, the leaving, the belief that it had been necessary. That staying would have complicated something he could not afford to complicate. "I had a flight," he said. The explanation automatic, but even as he said it, it sounded smaller than it once had, less certain, less absolute. Clara's lips pressed together briefly, not in anger, but in restraint, as if she had already walked through this version of the conversation alone more times than she could count. "You always had somewhere to be," she replied softly, and there was no judgment in it, only a quiet acknowledgement of the truth he had lived by. Ethan looked at her again, more sharply this time, because there was something she was not saying yet, something that lingered just beneath the surface of every word, and the unease in his chest tightened into something closer to realization. "Clara," he said, her name coming more naturally now, as if it had always belonged there. "What did I miss?" And the question hung there, open, unguarded, because for the first time, he was not trying to control the outcome, he was asking for it. Clara held his gaze, steady and unwavering, and for a moment, the noise of the lobby faded again, the movement around them blurring into something distant and irrelevant, because this was the moment everything shifted, the point where truth either stayed hidden or finally stepped into the light. She adjusted Lily gently, the child's head turning slightly, her face now more visible in the soft overhead lighting, and Ethan felt it again, stronger this time, that strange pull that made no sense and yet refused to be ignored. "You miss 5 years," Clara said, her voice calm but carrying a depth that made the words feel heavier than they sounded. "You missed every night she cried, every morning she learned something new, every time she asked me a question I could not answer." And she paused, just long enough for the meaning to settle, for the pieces to begin forming in a way that could no longer be dismissed. Ethan's expression changed, not dramatically, but undeniably, the certainty he had worn like armor beginning to fracture under the weight of what she was saying, because there was only one direction those words could lead, only one truth that connected them all. His eyes moved again to the child, really seeing her now, not just as a presence, but as a possibility, as a reality that had existed without him, growing, living, becoming something real while he had been somewhere else entirely. Clara took a slow breath, her fingers brushing lightly against Lily's back in a soothing motion, and when she spoke again, her voice did not rise, it did not need to, because the truth carried itself. "You remember the ending," she said, echoing the words that had started everything, but now there was something else in them, something firmer, something that could not be undone. "But you do not remember the beginning of her story." And as the words settled, there was no more space for doubt. No more room for misunderstanding, only the quiet, undeniable realization that whatever Ethan thought had ended 5 years ago had actually just begun, and he had not been there to see it. For a moment, Ethan did not move, did not speak, as if the world had narrowed down to just one undeniable truth standing in front of him, and everything else, the towering glass walls, the quiet footsteps of passing strangers, the endless obligations waiting upstairs, had faded into something distant and unreal. His eyes remained fixed on Lily, but now there was no distance left in that gaze, only a growing awareness that pressed against his chest with a weight he had never prepared for, because this was not a business decision, not a calculated risk, this was something far more irreversible. "You are saying," he began, but the words did not come easily, not with the certainty he was known for, because saying it meant accepting it, and accepting it meant facing 5 years of absence that no explanation could fully justify. Clara did not rush him, did not fill the silence, because she had learned long ago that some truths needed space to settle, needed time to be seen clearly instead of forced into understanding, and she simply stood there, steady, grounded, her presence quiet but unyielding. Lily shifted again, her small hand loosening slightly before curling again into the fabric of Clara's coat, and in that simple, unconscious motion, there was something so familiar that Ethan felt it hit deeper than any words could have, something instinctive, something that bypassed logic entirely. "She is 5. Clara said softly, not as a defense, not as a demand, but as a fact, simple and undeniable, and the number echoed differently this time, no longer just a measure of time, but a measure of everything he had missed, everything that had existed without him even knowing. Ethan inhaled slowly, the breath uneven in a way that would have been unthinkable just minutes ago, and he ran a hand through his hair, a rare break in composure. Because the careful structure he had built around his life did not account for this, did not have a place for something that could not be managed or predicted. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, and the question carried more than confusion now, it carried something closer to regret, something that had begun forming the moment realization took hold. Clara's expression softened again, but this time there was a trace of something deeper, something that had taken years to understand herself, and she shook her head slightly, as if the answer was not as simple as the question made it seem. "I tried," she said quietly, her voice steady but carrying the weight of memory. "But you were gone before I even knew what I needed to say." And the words settled between them with a quiet finality, because they spoke of timing, of missed moments that could not be rewound or corrected. Ethan's gaze dropped briefly, the truth of that statement landing harder than he expected, because he could see it now, not in full detail, but enough to understand the shape of it, a decision made quickly, a departure justified in the moment, and the consequences that had unfolded beyond his awareness. "I would have," he started, but the sentence did not finish, because even he knew that promises made after the fact did not carry the same weight as actions taken when they mattered most. Clara did not challenge him, did not ask for explanations or apologies, because that was not why she was here, and her attention shifted briefly to Lily, brushing her hand gently along the child's back in a motion that was both soothing and grounding. "She does not need what you would have done," Clara said softly, bringing his focus back to the present. "She needs what you will do now." And the simplicity of that statement cut through everything else, through the past, through the uncertainty, through the instinct to explain or defend, leaving only one question that truly mattered. Ethan looked at her again, then at Lily, and for the first time, the path in front of him was not something he could map out in advance, not something he could control with certainty, but something that required a different kind of decision, one that was not about success or failure, but about presence, about showing up in a way he had not before. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty, it was filled with possibility, with consequence, with the quiet understanding that whatever came next would define not just the future, but the meaning of everything that had come before. And as Ethan stood there, facing the life he had not known existed, he realized that remembering the ending had never been enough, not when the story was still waiting to be lived. The moment lingered, stretched thin between what had been said and what still remained unsaid, and Ethan felt the unfamiliar weight of hesitation settle into him, not the kind that came from uncertainty in business, but something deeper, something that asked for more than logic, more than control. His eyes moved once more to Lily, but this time he did not look away quickly, he let himself see her fully, the softness of her features, the quiet rise and fall of her breathing, the undeniable presence of a life that had existed parallel to his own without ever crossing into it until now. And the realization did not come as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable truth that settled into every part of him. "What does she know?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than before, stripped of authority, carrying something closer to caution, because this was no longer about him alone, it was about a child who had grown up without him, a child who had her own understanding of the world. Clara followed his gaze, her expression softening in a way that was almost instinctive, almost protective, and she adjusted Lily slightly, brushing her fingers gently along her daughter's back in a motion that had been repeated countless times over the years. "She knows she is loved," Clara said simply, and the clarity of that answer left no room for doubt, no space for anything unnecessary. "And she knows I have always been enough for her." And there was no pride in her voice, no need for validation, just a quiet certainty that came from having lived it every day. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the words, understanding the meaning behind them, because they were not just about the past, they were about the boundary that had been built in his absence, a boundary he could not simply step into without consequence. "And me?" he asked after a moment, the question almost careful, as if he were aware that the answer might not be easy, might not even be something he deserved yet. Clara's eyes met his again, steady, thoughtful, and for a moment she did not answer, not because she did not know, but because she was choosing her words with the same care she had used to build her life without him. "She knows there was someone who was not there," Clara said quietly, and the honesty in her voice carried no blame, only truth. "But she does not know who you are." And the words landed softly, but their impact was unmistakable, because they defined exactly where he stood, not in her life, not yet, but somewhere outside it, looking in. Ethan exhaled slowly, the reality of that position settling into him with a clarity he could not ignore, because it meant that whatever came next would not be about reclaiming something lost, but about earning something that had never been given. He glanced briefly around the lobby, the familiar space now feeling distant, almost irrelevant compared to the conversation unfolding within it, and then his attention returned to Clara and Lily, as if nothing else truly mattered in that moment. "I do not expect," he began, but stopped, the words falling short of what he meant, because expectation was not the right word, not here, not now. Clara noticed the shift, the hesitation, and for the first time, there was a faint trace of something softer in her expression, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a recognition that he was beginning to understand the weight of what stood between them. "This is not about what you expect," she said gently, her voice steady but not unkind. "It is about what you are willing to become." And the statement carried a quiet challenge, not demanding, not forceful, but undeniable, because it placed the future entirely in his hands without guaranteeing anything in return. Ethan held her gaze, the words settling into him, reshaping the way he saw the situation, because this was not a problem to solve, not a negotiation to win, it was something far more personal, far more uncertain, and for the first time in a long time, he did not have a clear answer, only the growing understanding that whatever he chose next would define more than just his own life. Lily shifted again, her small hand brushing lightly against Clara's collar before settling once more, and Ethan watched the movement with a quiet intensity. Not as an outsider now, but as someone who was beginning to realize that he had a place in that small, fragile world, even if he had not been there to see it grow. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty or uncertain, it was filled with the quiet weight of possibility, with the understanding that the past could not be changed, but the future had not yet been written, and as Ethan stood there, no longer just a man with everything, but a man who had just discovered what he had been missing, he understood that the next step would not be about remembering, it would be about proving that he could be more than the ending he had once chosen. The quiet between them was no longer fragile, it was heavy with decision, with the kind of weight that did not disappear once acknowledged, and Ethan felt it settle into him in a way that was unfamiliar, because for the first time, there was no immediate solution, no clear path forward that guaranteed success. He shifted slightly, not out of discomfort, but as if grounding himself in the moment. His attention never leaving Clara or the child resting against her, and for a brief second, he allowed himself to imagine what those 5 years might have looked like without him, the small moments, the ordinary days, the milestones that had come and gone unnoticed by the one person who should have been there. "What does she like?" he asked quietly, and the question seemed simple, almost out of place in the gravity of everything else, but it carried something deeper, something that spoke of an attempt to understand, to step into a world he had not known existed. Clara blinked once, slightly surprised by the shift, not because the question was difficult, but because it was the first time he had asked something that was not about the past, not about what had gone wrong, but about Lily herself. "She likes pancakes on Sundays," Clara answered after a moment, her voice softening just slightly. "With too much syrup, even when I tell her it is too much." And there was a faint warmth in her words now, a glimpse into a life that had been built quietly, piece by piece, without him. Ethan nodded slowly, holding on to that detail as if it mattered more than it should, because in that simple image, there was something real, something tangible, something that made this situation less abstract and more immediate. "And she likes stories," Clara added, almost as an afterthought, but not really, because it was part of who Lily was. "She always asks for one before she falls asleep, even when she is too tired to keep her eyes open." And for a moment, Clara's gaze softened as she looked down at her daughter, her hand brushing lightly through Lily's hair, a gesture so natural it did not require thought. Ethan watched that movement, the quiet connection between them, and something inside him shifted again, not sharply this time, but steadily, like a door opening just enough to let something new in. "I do not know how to do this," he admitted after a pause, the honesty in his voice unfiltered, unguarded, because there was no benefit in pretending otherwise, not here, not with her. Clara looked back at him, studying his expression carefully, and for the first time, there was no distance in her gaze, only a quiet assessment, as if she were deciding whether to believe what she was seeing. "You are not supposed to know," she replied gently, and there was no judgment in her tone, only truth. "You are supposed to learn." And the words settled between them with a kind of clarity that made everything else feel secondary. Ethan exhaled slowly, absorbing that, understanding that this was not something he could approach the way he approached everything else in his life. This required patience, consistency, something that could not be rushed or controlled. Lily stirred again, her eyes fluttering open just slightly, unfocused at first, then slowly adjusting to the light, and for a brief moment she looked directly at Ethan, her gaze curious but unafraid, the kind of innocent observation that children carried without understanding its significance. Ethan froze, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something that felt almost like recognition from the other side, and he held her gaze without moving, as if any sudden action might break the moment. Clara noticed it too. The way Lily's eyes lingered just a second longer than usual, and she did not interrupt, did not speak, allowing the quiet connection to exist without pressure. "Hi," Lily murmured softly, her voice still heavy with sleep, simple, unguarded, and completely unaware of the weight her presence carried in that moment. Ethan swallowed, the word catching somewhere between thought and voice, and when he finally spoke, it was softer than anything he had said before. "Hi." And it was not just a greeting, it was the beginning of something that had been missing for far too long, something that could not erase the past, but might, with time, begin to build something new in its place. The single word lingered longer than it should have, soft and simple, yet carrying a quiet weight that neither of them could ignore, and Ethan felt it settle somewhere deeper than anything that had been said before, because it was not a question, not an accusation, just a child's instinctive acknowledgement of someone new in her world. Lily blinked slowly, her small hand lifting just slightly as if to steady herself against the unfamiliar moment, and her gaze stayed on Ethan with a kind of calm curiosity that only children possessed, the kind that had not yet learned to question or fear. Clara shifted gently, her arms supporting Lily as she fully stirred awake, and for a brief second, her eyes met Ethan's, not as a challenge this time, but as a silent warning, not to rush, not to force something that needed to unfold in its own time. "This is Ethan," Clara said softly, choosing her words carefully, not adding more than necessary, because she understood that names carried weight, that Introductions could shape what came next. Lily tilted her head slightly, studying him in a way that was both innocent and thoughtful, her expression unguarded, and then she gave a small nod as if accepting the information without needing more explanation. "Hi, Ethan," she said, her voice clearer now, still gentle, still unaware of the depth behind the moment, and Ethan felt something shift again, not sharp or overwhelming, but steady, grounding, like something real taking root where there had once been only uncertainty. "Hi, Lily," he replied, and saying her name felt different, more significant than he expected, as if it connected him to something that had been just out of reach until now. There was a brief pause, not awkward, not tense, just quiet, as Lily continued to look at him, her small fingers brushing absently against the edge of Clara's coat, and then, as simply as she had spoken before, she asked, "Do you like pancakes?" And the question caught Ethan off guard, not because it was complicated, but because it was so completely ordinary, so completely rooted in the world she knew, and for a moment he almost smiled, the kind of expression that rarely appeared without intention. "I think I do," he answered, his voice softer, more genuine than it had been all day, and Lily seemed to accept that answer with quiet satisfaction, as if it confirmed something important in her own small way. Clara watched the exchange carefully, her expression unreadable at first, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a slight easing of the tension she had carried, because this was not what she had expected, not exactly, and yet it was something she had hoped for without allowing herself to fully believe it would happen. Lily yawned lightly, her head leaning back against Clara's shoulder, her energy already fading again, and she murmured something about syrup before her eyes began to close once more, the brief moment of wakefulness slipping away as easily as it had come. Ethan observed it all in silence, the simplicity of the interaction settling into him in a way that felt both new and familiar at the same time, because it was not grand, it was not dramatic, it was just real, and that made it more powerful than anything else. "She does that," Clara said quietly, her voice softer now, almost reflective. "She says what she feels without thinking about what it means." And there was no apology in her tone, only a quiet appreciation of the honesty that came so naturally to her daughter. Ethan nodded slightly, his gaze still resting on Lily, and for a moment, he did not try to analyze it, did not try to define what he was feeling, he simply allowed it to exist, because it was enough to understand that this was not something he could approach with distance or caution. It required presence, patience, something he was only just beginning to understand. Clara shifted again, preparing to move, to step away from the moment before it became something else, something heavier than it needed to be right now, and Ethan noticed the subtle change in her stance, the quiet signal that this conversation, this encounter, was reaching a natural pause. "We should go," Clara said gently, not as a rejection, not as a retreat, but as a boundary, a reminder that their lives did not exist only within this lobby, that there was more waiting beyond it. Ethan looked at her, then at Lily, and for the first time, the idea of them leaving did not feel like the end of something, but like the beginning of something he was not ready to let go of, and as he stood there, watching them, he realized that this was not about holding on to a moment, it was about finding a way to be part of what came after. Clara adjusted the strap of her worn bag slightly as she shifted Lily's weight in her arms, the small movement signaling her intention more clearly than her words had, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest, not urgency in the way he had known it before, but something quieter. Something that resisted the idea of simply letting them walk away as if this had been nothing more than a passing encounter. "Clara," he said, her name coming more naturally now, carrying less distance than before, and she paused, not turning immediately, but not continuing either, as if she had expected this moment and was giving it space to unfold. The lobby around them continued its quiet rhythm, footsteps echoing lightly against polished floors, distant voices blending into a soft, indistinct hum, but none of it seemed to reach the space between them anymore. "I do not want this to be the last time I see her," Ethan continued, his voice steady but no longer detached. Because this was not a negotiation, not a calculated statement, it was something closer to a decision forming in real time. Clara turned then, slowly, her gaze meeting his with a calm that had been shaped by years of carrying responsibility alone, and for a moment, she said nothing, allowing his words to settle, to reveal whether they held weight or were simply another passing intention. "You do not get to decide that alone," she replied gently, not harsh, not defensive, but firm in a way that left no room for misunderstanding, and there was no anger in her tone, only truth, the kind that came from knowing exactly what was at stake. Ethan nodded once, accepting the boundary without resistance, because he understood it now, understood that this was not something he could step into on his own terms, not anymore. "Then tell me how," he said, and the simplicity of the question carried more meaning than anything else he could have offered, because it acknowledged that he did not have the answers, that he was willing to follow instead of lead, at least for now. Clara studied him carefully, her eyes searching for something beyond the words, something that could not be spoken but had to be felt, and for a moment, the weight of the past lingered there, quiet but present, shaping her hesitation. Lily stirred again, her small head shifting slightly against Clara's shoulder, her breathing slow and even as sleep pulled her deeper once more. Unaware of the decisions being made around her, "You start small," Clara said finally, her voice steady, measured. "You show up when you say you will, you listen more than you speak, and you understand that this is not about fixing anything overnight." And each word carried the quiet authority of someone who had lived through the consequences of absence, who knew that trust was not given easily, and never all at once. Ethan absorbed her words without interruption, not because they were difficult to understand, but because they required something different from him, something he had not practiced in a long time: patience without control, effort without guarantee. "I can do that," he said, not with the confidence he used in boardrooms, but with a quieter certainty, one that did not promise perfection, only intention. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer, as if weighing that answer, measuring it against everything that had come before, and then she gave a small nod, not an agreement, not yet, but something close enough to a beginning. "There is a park 3 blocks from where we live," she said, her tone softening just slightly. "Sunday mornings around 10, that is where she likes to go after pancakes." And the detail felt deliberate, specific. Not an invitation exactly, but not a rejection either, something in between, something that required him to choose whether he would follow through or not. Ethan felt that information settle into him with a quiet clarity, not as an opportunity to control, but as a moment to prove something, not to her, not entirely, but to himself as well. "I will be there," he said, and this time, the words were not about expectation, they were about commitment, simple and unembellished. Clara nodded once more, her expression calm, but there was something different in her eyes now, something that had not been there before, not quite trust, but perhaps the first step toward it, and without saying anything else, she turned, beginning to walk toward the exit, Lily resting quietly against her as if the world had not shifted at all. Ethan remained where he was, watching them go, not with the detachment he had started with, but with a quiet awareness that this was not an ending, not this time, and as the glass doors opened and closed behind them, he realized that for the first time in years, he was not thinking about what he had lost, but about what he still had a chance to build. The lobby felt quieter after they left, not because the noise had changed, but because something inside Ethan had shifted in a way that made everything else seem distant, less urgent than it had been just minutes ago. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, his eyes lingering on the glass doors where Clara had disappeared, replaying the last few words in his mind, not as a memory to analyze, but as something to hold on to. Something that mattered beyond the usual rhythm of his life. Sunday morning, 10 o'clock, 3 blocks from where they lived, the details repeated themselves with a clarity he rarely reserved for anything outside of business, and yet this felt more important than any meeting he had ever scheduled. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the familiar vibration pulling him back into the world he had built, a world that demanded immediate attention, constant decisions, and he glanced at the screen briefly, seeing messages stacked one after another, urgent in their own way, but for the first time in years, he did not respond right away, he did not let them take control of his next step. Instead, he turned slowly, walking toward the private elevator, his reflection catching in the polished metal doors, and for a brief second, he paused, steadying himself not as a CEO, not as someone defined by success or control, but as a man who had just been told that 5 years of a life existed without him. A life that now stood within reach if he chose to step into it. The elevator doors opened quietly, and he stepped inside, the familiar space suddenly feeling different, smaller in a way that had nothing to do with its size, and as the doors closed, he exhaled slowly, allowing the silence to settle around him. Images came back to him more clearly now, not just fragments, but moments, the rain against the window that night, the way Clara had looked at him, not with expectation, but with something more open. Something that had invited him to stay, and he remembered the decision he had made, the flight he had chosen, the belief that leaving had been the right thing, the necessary thing, and for the first time, that certainty felt incomplete. The elevator moved upward, floor numbers lighting up one by one, but his focus remained somewhere else entirely, on a small park he had never seen, on pancakes with too much syrup, on a child who had asked him a simple question as if he already belonged in her world. When the doors opened to his floor, his assistant was already waiting. Tablet in hand, expression composed but expectant, ready to walk him through the next set of meetings, the next series of decisions that would shape the company's direction. "You have a call in 5 minutes," she began, but Ethan raised a hand gently, not dismissive, but firm, and for a brief moment she paused, surprised by the interruption, because it was not something he usually did. "Reschedule it," he said calmly, his voice steady but carrying a quiet authority that was different from before, less about control, more about choice, and she hesitated just long enough to register the shift before nodding and adjusting her notes. Ethan walked past her, moving toward his office, the large glass walls offering a view of the city that stretched endlessly beyond, but today, it did not hold his attention the way it usually did. Instead, he set his phone down on the desk, untouched, and stood there for a moment, letting the silence fill the space, letting the weight of what had happened settle into something real, something that could not be ignored or postponed. Sunday was not far, just a few days. But it felt like a turning point already, not because of what might happen, but because of what it required from him: consistency, presence, something he could not delegate or control from a distance. He reached for his calendar, not to schedule a meeting, not to fill another space with obligation, but to mark a moment that would not be moved. And as he entered the time, he realized that this was not just an appointment, it was a promise, not spoken aloud, but understood in a way that did not need words. Outside, the city continued as it always did, fast, relentless, filled with people moving toward their own destinations, but inside that quiet office, something had changed, something that did not depend on success or status. Something that required him to show up in a way he never had before, and as Ethan stood there, looking out at a world he had once believed he fully understood, he realized that for the first time, he was not planning his next move, he was preparing to become someone new. Sunday arrived slower than Ethan expected and faster than he was ready for, the kind of morning that carried a quiet stillness before the city fully woke, sunlight stretching softly across sidewalks that had not yet filled with noise. And for the first time in years, he woke without reaching for his phone, without checking messages or schedules, because there was only one place he needed to be. And it was not written in any calendar that anyone else could see. He stood in his kitchen longer than necessary, the unfamiliar pause in his routine not uncomfortable, just different, as if his mind was adjusting to something that could not be rushed or controlled. And when he finally stepped outside, the air felt cooler than usual, crisp in a way that made everything seem more present, more real. The park was exactly where Clara had said it would be, 3 blocks from a part of the city he had never had a reason to visit, and yet as he approached, it did not feel unfamiliar. It felt like stepping into something he should have known long ago, something simple, unguarded, where people existed without expectation or performance. Children's laughter carried lightly through the air. The distant creak of swings moving back and forth, the soft rhythm of footsteps along the paved path, and Ethan slowed his pace slightly, taking it in without analyzing it, without reducing it to something measurable. He spotted them near a bench beneath a wide tree, Clara sitting with a paper cup in her hand, Lily standing a few feet away, focused entirely on something small and important in her world, a trail of ants moving along the edge of the path, her attention unwavering in a way that only children could manage. Clara looked up first, her gaze finding him before he could decide how to approach, and for a brief second, there was something unreadable in her expression, not surprise, not expectation, just quiet observation, as if she were measuring not just his presence, but what it meant that he had come at all. Ethan did not rush, did not call out, he simply walked toward them at a steady pace, each step carrying more intention than anything he had done in a long time, and when he reached them, he stopped a few feet away, not too close, not too distant, allowing the moment to exist without forcing it forward. "You are early," Clara said softly, her voice calm, and there was no accusation in it, only a quiet acknowledgement. Ethan glanced briefly at his watch, then back at her, and for a moment, the instinct to explain, to justify, almost surfaced, but he let it pass, because it did not matter, not here. "I did not want to be late," he replied simply, and the honesty of it settled between them without resistance. Lily looked up then, her small face brightening with recognition, not because she fully understood who he was, but because he was familiar now, part of a memory that had been gentle, safe. "You came," she said, her voice carrying a quiet certainty, as if there had never been a doubt, and Ethan felt something shift again, something deeper, because in her world, showing up was not extraordinary, it was expected, it was the beginning of trust. "I said I would," he answered, and this time, the words carried more than intention, they carried action, proof that he had followed through, even in something as small as this. Lily nodded, satisfied, as if that was all the confirmation she needed, and she returned to her aunts, her focus already shifting back to the small details that made up her morning. Clara watched him carefully, her expression softer than before, but still guarded in a way that came from experience, from knowing that one moment did not define everything, but it could begin to change something. Ethan remained where he was for a second longer, then glanced around the park, taking in the space not as an outsider now, but as someone trying to understand where he fit within it, and when he looked back at Clara, there was no hesitation left in his voice, only a quiet determination. "What do we do next?" he asked, not as someone seeking control, but as someone willing to learn, willing to follow a path he did not yet fully understand, and in that simple question, there was something new, something that had not existed before, not in him, not in this moment, but something that might, with time, become the beginning of something real. Clara did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she understood that this question mattered more than it seemed, that the way she responded would shape not just the moment, but everything that came after, and she took a slow sip from her coffee before setting the cup down beside her on the bench, her eyes briefly following Lily as the child crouched lower to observe the tiny line of ants with complete focus. "We stay," Clara said finally, her voice calm, steady, as if the simplicity of the answer carried everything it needed to, and Ethan nodded once, absorbing it without question, because for the first time, doing nothing felt like doing something meaningful, like choosing presence over action. He moved closer then, not too near, just enough to sit on the far end of the bench, leaving space between them, respecting a boundary that did not need to be spoken, and for a moment, they both watched Lily in silence, the small, ordinary scene unfolding in a way that felt almost unfamiliar to him, not because it was complicated, but because it was so simple it could not be controlled or optimized. "She counts them," Clara said softly, her voice carrying a quiet warmth as she observed her daughter. "Even when they keep moving, she tries to keep track." And there was something in the way she said it that made Ethan look closer, not just at Lily, but at the patience behind the act, the determination in something so small. "Does she ever finish?" he asked, his tone lighter now, not in humor, but in curiosity, genuine and unguarded. Clara shook her head slightly, a faint smile touching her lips. "No, but she does not mind." And that answer seemed to linger with him, because it carried something larger than the moment, something about effort without expectation, about showing up without needing a perfect outcome. Lily glanced up again, her attention shifting easily as children's did, and she walked toward them with small, quick steps, stopping just in front of Ethan as if the distance between them had already shortened in her mind. "Do you want to see?" she asked, her voice bright with invitation, and Ethan hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not because he did not want to, but because he was aware of how much this moment mattered, how easily it could be mishandled if he moved too quickly or not at all. "Yes," he said, rising from the bench with a calm that did not betray the quiet significance of the moment, and he followed her a few steps back to the edge of the path, crouching slightly to match her level, not towering over her, but meeting her where she was. Lily pointed to the ants, explaining something in a soft, excited voice, her words simple, her logic entirely her own, and Ethan listened, really. Listened, not interrupting, not correcting, just allowing her world to exist as it was. Clara watched from the bench, her posture relaxed but attentive, her eyes moving between them, and for the first time, there was no tension in her expression, only a quiet observation, as if she were seeing something unfold that she had not been sure would ever happen. Ethan nodded occasionally, responding in small, thoughtful ways, not trying to impress, not trying to lead, just being present in a way that felt new even to himself. And when Lily laughed softly at something only she fully understood, he felt it again, that quiet shift inside him. Something settling into place not because it was perfect, but because it was real. After a while, Lily's attention drifted again, as it always did, and she wandered back toward the swings, her steps light, her focus already on something else, and Ethan stood there for a moment before returning to the bench, the space beside Clara no longer feeling like a boundary, but like something he was slowly learning how to step into. "You did not try to fix it," Clara said quietly, not looking at him, but her voice carried a subtle note of recognition, as if she had been waiting to see whether he would approach the moment differently. Ethan followed her gaze toward Lily, watching as she climbed onto the swing with determined effort, and he shook his head slightly, a small, thoughtful motion. "I am starting to understand that not everything needs to be fixed." And the words felt different from anything he had said before, less like a conclusion, more like a realization still forming. Clara nodded once, and there was something softer in that movement, something that acknowledged the change without needing to define it, and as they sat there, watching Lily move through her small, self-contained world, the silence between them was no longer uncertain, it was steady, filled with the quiet understanding that this was how it began, not with grand gestures or immediate answers, but with small moments that, over time, could become something lasting, something neither of them had been able to name before, but were now beginning to see take shape right in front of them. The morning unfolded slowly, without urgency, without the sharp edges of expectation that usually defined Ethan's world, and as he sat beside Clara watching Lily move back and forth on the swing, her laughter rising and falling with each gentle push of her legs, something settled into him with a quiet certainty he had not known before. It was not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady, like something finding its place after being lost for far too long. Clara remained still beside him, her gaze following Lily with a calm attentiveness that spoke of years spent being everything her daughter needed, and for a moment either of them spoke, because there was nothing to explain, nothing to fill, only the simple presence of being there. "She will ask questions," Clara said finally, her voice soft but clear, as if she were placing something important into the space between them. "Not all at once, but eventually." And Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that this was not a warning, not a barrier, but a truth he would need to be ready for. "I will answer them," he said, and there was no hesitation this time, no uncertainty in his tone, only a quiet resolve that came not from confidence, but from choice. Clara glanced at him then, studying his expression for a moment longer than usual, and there was something different in her eyes now, something that had shifted from guarded distance to cautious recognition, not of who he had been, but of who he might be becoming. Lily's laughter echoed again as she slowed the swing, her small feet dragging lightly against the ground until she came to a stop. And she turned back toward them with the same open curiosity she had shown from the beginning, as if every moment was simply another part of her day, another piece of something she trusted without needing to understand. Can you push me? She asked, looking directly at Ethan, her voice simple, her request unburdened by anything beyond the immediate moment, and for a second, the world seemed to pause around that question, because it was small, ordinary, but it carried something larger than either of them could ignore. Ethan stood without hesitation this time, stepping toward her with a calm that did not come from certainty, but from willingness, and as he placed his hands lightly on the swing, careful, measured, he felt the quiet significance of the moment settle into him. He did not push hard, did not try to make the moment bigger than it was, he simply moved the swing forward gently, matching her rhythm, letting her guide the pace, and Lily smiled, a small, genuine expression that did not ask for more than what was being given. Clara watched from the bench, her posture relaxed in a way that had not been there before, her hands resting loosely in her lap, and for the first time, there was no tension in her shoulders, no readiness to step in or pull away, only a quiet acceptance of what was unfolding. The swing moved back and forth, steady, unhurried, and with each motion, Ethan felt the distance of 5 years not disappear, but begin to soften, not erased, not forgotten, but no longer defining everything that came after. When Lily laughed again, brighter this time, he found himself smiling without thinking, not the controlled, practiced expression he used in public, but something simpler. Something real. After a few moments, he slowed the swing gently, letting it come to rest, and Lily turned back toward him, her eyes bright, her voice soft but certain. You did it right. And the words, simple as they were, settled deeper than anything else had, because they were not about perfection, not about fixing the past, they were about showing up in the present and being enough in that moment. Ethan glanced briefly at Clara, and she met his gaze with a small nod, not approval, not forgiveness, but something quieter, something that acknowledged the step without needing to define it. The sun had risen higher now, casting a warmer light across the park, and as the morning continued, nothing felt rushed, nothing felt forced, because for the first time, the story between them was not about what had ended, it was about what was beginning, slowly, carefully, built not on promises spoken in the past, but on actions chosen in the present. And as Ethan stood there, watching Lily run toward the bench with something new to share, he understood that remembering the ending had never been the point, because the meaning of it all was not in what he had once left behind, but in what he was finally willing to stay for.